Long before the sun made any promises to the day, the house was already awake. Not in the way its owners imagined, of course. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. No curtains were drawn back. No polished shoes waited by the door. No one above the staircase stirred with purpose or ambition. And yet somewhere beneath the thick carpets and carefully chosen silence, movement had begun. The house inhaled quietly, pipes warmed, floors remembered their duty. A machine made entirely of people turned on without ceremony. In Victorian England, comfort did not arrive in the morning. It arrived earlier than that, much earlier, and it arrived without asking to be noticed. In 1885, in a large Victorian house belonging to the wealthy, night did not end all at once. It retreated unevenly. Upstairs, darkness lingered politely, allowing its residents to sleep on, confident that morning would eventually sort itself out. Downstairs, however, the night had already been dismissed. Time behaved differently there. It did not stretch lazily, it marched. Before dawn had any color, before birds considered participation, the servants were awake. Not because they were particularly disciplined or morally superior, but because the house required it. Comfort, as it turns out, is a demanding creature. It prefers to be fed early and often. Victorian houses were not just places to live. They were systems, carefully balanced, endlessly repetitive systems. Above the stairs existed a world of ease, warmth, and presumed effortlessness. Fires burned as if by instinct. Tea appeared without explanation. Rooms remained orderly in ways that suggested they simply preferred to be that way. Below the stairs existed another reality entirely, one that understood very clearly how much effort it took to maintain the illusion upstairs. The servant's day began in darkness, not because it was poetic, but because it was practical. Fires needed to be lit long before anyone wanted to feel warm. Water had to be carried, boiled, and prepared before it could pretend to arrive effortlessly in a wash basin. Floors required attention before footsteps were allowed to suggest elegance. By the time the household above stirred, the hardest work of the morning was already finished, which conveniently meant it never counted. There is something gently ironic about how invisible this labor was meant to be. Servants were not hidden because they were unimportant. They were hidden because they were essential. A visible system invites questions. An invisible one feels natural. And Victorian comfort relied heavily on the idea that things simply happened. Downstairs, names mattered very little. Roles mattered a great deal. The scullery maid, the kitchen maid, the footman, the housemaid. Titles replaced identities. These were not people so much as functions with pulse. They existed to ensure that nothing above ground ever appeared unfinished, unheeded, or uncertain. This arrangement was not particularly cruel by the standards of its time. That may be the most unsettling part. It was ordinary, expected, even considered efficient. The house did not wake early because it was unkind. It woke early because that was how houses like this survived without disturbing those they served. As the servants moved through their routines, the house responded. It warmed slowly, like an animal that had learned to trust the process. Kitchens filled with quiet sound, the scrape of coal, the controlled clatter of tools designed to clean up after people who never saw them used. Everything happened with restraint. Noise was a risk. Being noticed was worse. Above the staircase, bedrooms remained sealed in stillness. Thick doors, heavy drapes, layers of insulation not just against cold, but against awareness. The design was intentional. Architecture, like etiquette, knew exactly what it was doing. Two worlds shared a roof, but not a rhythm. Upstairs, time was generous. Downstairs, it was precise. One side of the house measured the day in meals and social obligations. The other measured it in tasks completed before anyone realized they were needed. And yet, the house could not function without this imbalance. Every polished surface depended on unseen hands. Every quiet morning relied on a night that never truly rested. The servants were not mentioned because mentioning them would have complicated the story the house wanted to tell about itself. There is a mild, almost polite absurdity to how this was normalized. Comfort upstairs was treated as a natural state, like weather or gravity. If the fire was warm, it was because it should be. If breakfast appeared, it was because mornings demanded it. The idea that dozens of small decisions, movements, and aches had made this possible was simply unnecessary. Servants understood this arrangement very well. They were not under the illusion that they would be remembered. Their success was measured by how completely they disappeared from the narrative of the day. A good morning was one where nothing seemed to have required effort. This is where the quiet irony settles in. The people who worked hardest to hold the house together were the ones least allowed to leave a trace. Their labor created stability, order, and calm, but never recognition. The house rested on their discipline while pretending it rested on good taste. Before dawn, the house was honest. It revealed its dependence. It acknowledged briefly that warmth had to be made, not wished, into existence. But as morning approached, honesty retreated. By the time the owners awoke, the illusion was complete. The house stood ready, calm, cooperative, as though it had always been that way. This was not a story of rebellion or suffering played at high volume. It was quieter than that. It was the story of how systems function best when they do not need to explain themselves, of how entire lives can be organized around the task of making other lives feel effortless. And so, before the sun reached the windows of the upper floors, before anyone upstairs considered the day ahead, the most important work had already been done. The house was awake. The house was prepared. The house was ready to pretend that none of this had required anyone to wake early at all. The first bell of the day. The day did not begin with light. It began with sound. A bell, precise and unimpressed, moved through the house like a reminder that time belonged to someone else. It was not loud enough to be dramatic and not gentle enough to be ignored. It did not ask whether anyone was ready. It did not care. In a Victorian household, waking was not a personal experience. It was an instruction. There was no such thing as waking naturally for the servants. Sleep was not something you drifted out of. It was something you were pulled from. The bell did not signal a new day in the romantic sense. It simply announced that the previous one had ended its pause. Time here was not measured in hours. It was divided into tasks: light the fires, prepare the water, sweep the floors that would later be walked on as if they cleaned themselves. The bell did not say good morning. It said quite clearly, begin. The servants' bedrooms sat high in the house, tucked beneath the roof, where warmth thinned out and space became negotiable. These rooms were not designed for comfort so much as containment. Sloped ceilings leaned in slightly as if listening. Windows were small and unambitious. The air was colder, even in summer, and in winter it felt as though the house had decided these rooms were optional. Beds were narrow. Furniture was minimal. Personal items, if they existed, had learned to stay out of the way. These rooms were not places to linger. They were places to stop moving briefly. When the first bell rang, there was no confusion about what to do next. That part had been solved long ago. Bodies moved before thoughts had time to form opinions. Blankets were folded quickly, not out of tidiness, but because leaving them unfolded felt inefficient. There was no mirror gazing, no moment of reflection. Faces were washed just enough to appear functional. Hair was arranged to comply, not to express. Dressing happened in silence, not because talking was forbidden, but because it would have been unnecessary. Clothes were work clothes, chosen for durability and familiarity. Buttons were fastened by memory. Laces tightened without attention. The body dressed itself while the mind stayed politely detached. There was something almost meditative about this repetition. When a routine has been performed thousands of times, it no longer requires decision. It becomes a shape you step into. That, oddly enough, made it easier to endure. Thinking too much would have complicated things. The second bell existed as a warning, not a suggestion. It reminded everyone that being late was a personal failure, even though time itself was not personally owned. Leaving the room happened quickly. Doors closed softly, not out of courtesy, but out of habit. Sound traveled easily up here, and attention was never helpful. Corridors at this hour felt unfinished, dim, narrow. These were not the hallways guests ever saw. They were practical routes designed for movement, not admiration. Footsteps were measured, no one hurried, but no one wandered either. There was a practiced economy to how bodies navigated space. Down the stairs, the house began to assemble itself. Kitchens accepted their occupants without comment. Tools waited where they always waited. The day's first tasks slid into place, as if continuing a conversation that had never quite stopped. What is unsettling is not the work itself. Work, after all, is straightforward. What lingers is how completely this system removed the idea of choice. The bell rang, and the body responded, not because it wanted to, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The system did not require cruelty to function. It required consistency. Above, the owners of the house remained asleep. This was not neglect. It was design. Their rest depended on this early motion. The silence they enjoyed was made possible by the fact that others had already begun making noise elsewhere, quietly. The servants understood this arrangement with a clarity that required no explanation. Their day existed so that another day could appear effortless. Their movements were part of a chain reaction that ended with warm rooms, clean clothes, and a household that appeared to run on good breeding alone. There is a faint irony in how proud Victorian society was of its order. Order, in this case, was something you outsourced. It arrived ready-made, delivered by people who had learned to wake before the concept of morning became fashionable. As the sky outside shifted slowly, almost reluctantly, the servants had already moved past the point of noticing. Dawn was not an event worth observing. It did not change the list of tasks. It did not shorten the day. Light was useful only insofar as it revealed what still needed to be done. And so, while the house above dreamed, The house below continued its quiet work. The first bell had done its job. The system was awake. Individual thoughts could wait. In a few hours, the household would appear calm, orderly, and naturally well run. No one would comment on how early the day had begun, or for whom. That, too, was part of the design. The bell faded, the routine continued, and the house, once again, pretended it had always been awake. Two worlds under one roof. From the street, the house looked singular, solid, respectable, a unified statement of wealth and permanence. Its windows aligned politely, its doors promised symmetry. Nothing about it suggested internal disagreement. And yet, the moment one crossed the threshold, it became clear that this was not a shared environment. It was a layered one. Victorian houses were built to tell two stories at once. One story was meant to be seen, the other was meant to be used. The fact that both stories unfolded under the same roof was not an act of unity, but of efficiency. Upstairs belonged to the family. These rooms were generous in proportion and intention. Ceilings were high enough to allow air to linger. Windows invited light without urgency. Walls were softened by fabric, pattern, and ornament. Space here encouraged stillness. Chairs waited patiently to be occupied. Fireplaces suggested pause rather than necessity. Time moved differently in these rooms, as if it were aware it was being observed. Below stairs, time had no audience. The servants' world was built around movement. Rooms were narrower, ceilings lower, corners sharper. These spaces did not invite reflection. They directed behavior. You passed through them quickly, efficiently, without emotional attachment. Lingering felt inappropriate, almost impolite, as though the room itself disapproved. The separation between these worlds was enforced by architecture long before it was enforced by etiquette. Staircases made the distinction obvious. The main staircase curved proudly through the heart of the house, wide enough for dresses, pauses, and conversation. It was a stage. It assumed attention. Elsewhere, often near kitchens or tucked behind walls, another staircase existed, narrow, steep, entirely uninterested in grace. This was not a route meant to be admired. It was a solution. It allowed servants to move vertically through the house without intersecting with the performance happening above. The goal was not speed. It was discretion. Corridors followed the same logic. Public hallways were long, bright, and carpeted, designed to be walked slowly. Private passages were short, dim, and functional. These were not spaces you occupied. They were spaces you escaped through. Light was treated as a privilege. Upstairs, it was encouraged, shaped, filtered through lace and glass. Lamps softened it further, turning illumination into atmosphere. Downstairs, light was measured. Windows were smaller, often placed high on the wall, reminding occupants that the outside world was not the point. Artificial light did most of the work, and it did so plainly without decoration or warmth. Temperature obeyed hierarchy as well. Fires were built where comfort was expected. Heat traveled downward only if it had nothing better to do. Servants' areas remained noticeably cooler, a condition often described as practical rather than intentional. Cooler rooms kept bodies moving. Warmth invited rest. Materials reinforced this division quietly but persistently. Upstairs surfaces absorbed sound, carpets muted footsteps, upholstery softened weight. Downstairs surfaces resisted it. Floors were harder, walls barer, Everything was chosen to endure repetition, not admiration. Durability replaced beauty as the guiding principle. Sound, too, had rules. Above, silence was cultivated. Below, it was managed. Clatter happened here so that it would not happen elsewhere. Kitchens accepted noise as part of their function. Elsewhere, restraint became habit. Servants learned quickly how much sound was too much sound. What makes this separation unsettling is not that it existed, but how normalized it was. There were no signs announcing restricted areas, no locked doors requiring permission. The house simply taught you where you belonged. New servants learned the geography of invisibility within days. Certain doors were not for them, certain rooms were only entered when empty, certain paths existed solely to avoid being noticed. This was not framed as exclusion, it was framed as order. Victorian society spoke often about harmony. Everyone had a place, everyone had a role. This architectural division was considered respectful, even considerate. The family was spared inconvenience. The servants were spared awkward encounters. Everyone, in theory, benefited. In practice, the house relied on constant crossing between these worlds. Servants moved invisibly into family spaces to clean, prepare, adjust, and restore. Their presence was continuous, but their visibility was carefully controlled. The ideal servant was not absent. They were unnoticed. Meals appeared upstairs without evidence of preparation. Fires burned as if they had always been lit. Rooms reset themselves overnight. The house performed competence without revealing rehearsal. Downstairs, nothing disappeared. Everything accumulated. Laundry waited. Dishes stacked. Floors dried slowly. Effort was visible here, unavoidable and endless. This was where the house admitted how much work it required to appear effortless. The separation between worlds had to be maintained actively. Doors were closed, curtains drawn, roots respected. Any breach was corrected quietly, not with punishment, but with discomfort. Being seen in the wrong place carried a particular weight. It was not anger that followed, but embarrassment. The system preferred compliance without confrontation. There is a faint, dry irony in how elaborate this invisibility became. Entire architectural features existed solely to prevent encounters that everyone knew would be harmless. Back corridors twisted out of sight. Service doors blended into walls. The house was filled with secret paths, whose only function was to preserve the illusion that servants were not constantly nearby. Of course, everyone knew they were. That knowledge simply had no place upstairs. Two worlds shared one roof, one visible, one functional, one designed for comfort, the other designed to produce it. They did not compete. They cooperated quietly, unevenly, and without discussion. This arrangement endured not because it was questioned, but because it was never meant to be. The house worked because it did not ask whether it should. It simply continued day after day, reinforcing the boundaries that kept it stable. And as the morning advanced, these two worlds would touch repeatedly without acknowledgement. Objects would change hands, rooms would be crossed, work would be completed. The separation would remain intact, held in place by design, habit, and a shared understanding that comfort survives best when its origins remain politely out of sight. Under one roof, two realities coexisted. Not in conflict, just carefully, consistently apart. Order and hierarchy. The house did not rely on chaos. It relied on clarity. Everything within it followed a ranking so precise that it rarely needed to be spoken aloud. In a large Victorian household, order was not maintained through force or constant instruction. It was maintained through familiarity. Everyone knew where they stood, because the house reminded them constantly. At the center of this system stood the butler and the housekeeper. They were not the most powerful people in the house, but they were the most informed. Power here was not about ownership, it was about coordination. These two figures knew the rhythm of the household better than anyone else. They knew when doors should open, when rooms should be empty, and when silence was required. They did not raise their voices often. They did not need to. Keys were the most obvious symbols of this authority. Heavy, numerous, carefully assigned. Not everyone carried them, and no one carried all of them. Each key represented access, responsibility, and trust. To hold keys was to move freely through the house. To lack them was to wait. The sound of keys mattered almost as much as the keys themselves. A particular jingle in the corridor meant something. A pause before a door opened meant something else. Servants learned to interpret these sounds the way sailors read weather. Without seeing anything, they understood who was approaching, what mood might follow, and whether to remain visible or disappear. Nothing about this learning was formal. No lessons were given. Observation did the work. New servants watched carefully. They learned which footsteps belonged to authority and which did not. They learned the difference between a hurried step and a deliberate one. Sound became information. Schedules governed everything. They were written down, revised, and protected. Meals, cleaning, deliveries, rest periods each had its assigned time and place. Deviations were not disasters, but they were noted. The house ran on memory reinforced by ink. Books were kept meticulously. Inventories listed objects that rarely moved. Linen was counted, silver was tracked. Nothing was too small to be recorded because nothing was truly insignificant. A missing item was not just a loss, it was a disturbance in the system. Servants learned quickly that awareness was more valuable than effort. Working hard was expected. Working intelligently, meaning quietly, predictably, and in the correct sequence was respected. The goal was not to stand out. It was to fit perfectly into the pattern. Hierarchy shaped even the most ordinary interactions. Who spoke first? Who waited? Who stood? And who sat? These were not decisions made consciously each time. They were reflexes developed through repetition. Chairs themselves seemed to understand who they were meant for. In the servants' hall, seating arrangements reflected rank. The butler occupied a position that allowed him to observe without appearing to do so. Senior staff sat closer to warmth and light. Junior servants remained nearer the edges. This was not cruelty. It was order. Order was comforting. It told everyone what was expected. The housekeeper moved through this structure with quiet authority. She did not need to announce herself. Her presence reorganized space automatically. Conversations adjusted. Tasks clarified. Her role was not to dominate, but to align. What is unsettling about this system is how little resistance it encountered. The hierarchy was accepted because it was legible. Everyone could read it. The rules were consistent. That consistency created a sense of stability, even for those at the bottom. Servants did not imagine themselves rising endlessly through the ranks. Advancement existed, but it was modest. A better position meant slightly more responsibility, slightly more trust, and perhaps a key or two. The ceiling was visible. That visibility made the limits easier to live with. Much of this order was enforced not through commands, but through anticipation. Servants learned to predict needs before they were spoken. Anticipation was a skill. It required attention to detail, memory, and restraint. Acting too early was as undesirable as acting too late. The house itself rewarded predictability. When everyone performed their role correctly, the system felt smooth, almost effortless. Tension arose only when someone misread the hierarchy. A junior servant speaking out of turn. A task completed at the wrong moment. These were small disruptions, but they stood out precisely because everything else was so controlled. There is a quiet irony in how much intelligence this system required from those who benefited least from it. Servants needed to understand not only their own duties, but the relative importance of everyone else's. They learned when to step forward and when to vanish. They learned to manage their presence carefully. Upstairs, the family rarely considered this structure. They experienced its results, not its mechanisms. Meals arrived on time, rooms were prepared, schedules unfolded without friction. The order felt natural, even deserved. Downstairs, the system was constantly reinforced. Correction happened gently but firmly. A look, a pause, a reminder disguised as advice. Authority here did not shout, it adjusted. The unsettling calm of this hierarchy came from its reliability. Nothing about it was chaotic, nothing was improvised. Everyone knew their place, and the house rewarded those who stayed within it. And so, hour by hour, the system held. Keys turned, books were updated, footsteps were interpreted, chairs remained where they were meant to be. The house continued its quiet instruction, teaching each person how to belong, without ever saying the word aloud. Order did not need to be enforced loudly. It simply needed to be understood. The servant's meal. The servant's breakfast did not announce itself. It did not arrive with ceremony, anticipation, or lingering conversation. It happened because it was scheduled to happen, and it ended because there was other work waiting. The meal took place downstairs, in a room designed to be functional rather than welcoming. Tables were long, sturdy, and unadorned. Chairs were placed where they always were. Nothing about the arrangement suggested choice. You did not decide where to sit. You remembered. Food was served quickly, not rushed, but efficient. There was enough of it. This was not a house that starved its servants, but it was distributed carefully. Portions reflected position. Senior staff received slightly more, slightly better, slightly warmer. Junior servants received what remained, which was still sufficient, but never indulgent. This was not framed as unfair. It was framed as order. Everyone understood that the table below stairs mirrored the table above. The family dined according to rank, preference, and occasion. So did the servants. The difference was that upstairs, this hierarchy was dressed in conversation and etiquette. Downstairs, it was exposed plainly, without distraction. Seating followed strict patterns. The butler occupied a position that allowed oversight without intrusion. The housekeeper sat where she could observe both people and plates. Senior staff clustered closer to the center. Junior staff found places nearer the ends, where chairs were less comfortable and conversation less likely. No one argued about this. Argument would have suggested misunderstanding. Understanding here was a survival skill. The meal moved at a steady pace. There was little talking, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unnecessary. Mornings were for efficiency. Words were saved for later, if they were saved at all. Eating was another task, to be completed before the next bell. There is something quietly unsettling about how much meaning sat at that table without ever being discussed. A glance could confirm rank. A shift in seating signaled change. Someone arriving earlier than usual might find themselves closer to the center. Someone late accepted a place farther out without comment. Memory mattered more than appetite. The food itself was plain: bread, porridge, tea, occasionally something warm carried over from the kitchen's preparations for upstairs. Nothing extravagant, nothing memorable. The purpose was fuel, not pleasure. Enjoyment was optional, readiness was required, and yet there was a subtle comfort in this predictability. The meal happened every day, more or less the same way. In a system where time belonged to someone else, knowing when you would eat mattered. The body learned to trust that at least consistency would hold. Hierarchy shaped even how long one lingered. Senior staff ate at a measured pace. Junior servants learned to finish quickly. Remaining seated too long suggested idleness. Standing too early suggested impatience. Balance was learned through observation. There was no discussion of fairness. Fairness implied alternatives. The system did not offer alternatives. It offered clarity. Everyone knew exactly where they stood, how much they would receive, and how quickly they were expected to return to work. This clarity was often mistaken for harmony. The irony, of course, is that the servant's meal reflected the household above with remarkable accuracy. The family enjoyed variety and choice. Servants enjoyed reliability and structure. Both meals reinforced status. One simply did so with better tableware. Above stairs, meals were social events. Downstairs, they were logistical ones. Upstairs, seating could shift depending on guests and moods. Downstairs, seating shifted only when rank changed, and rank changed slowly, if at all. Servants learned to read the table the way they read schedules and footsteps. A change in portion size meant something. A new seating arrangement meant something else. These signals were subtle, but they mattered. They were how the system communicated. There's a faint, dry humor in how much discipline went into this brief pause for nourishment. Even rest was structured. Even eating reinforced position. Even hunger was organized. No one complained. Complaints suggested expectation. Expectation was dangerous. The goal was to fit neatly into the rhythm, not to interrupt it. When the meal ended, plates were cleared with the same efficiency that had brought them. Chairs were pushed in. The room reset itself quickly. There was no lingering warmth, no invitation to stay. The pause was complete. Some servants left feeling satisfied. Others left feeling merely prepared. Either way, the system had done its work. Bodies were fueled. Hierarchy was reaffirmed. Memory was reinforced. Above, the family would soon gather for their own breakfast. They would sit in rooms designed for comfort, discuss plans for the day, and enjoy food that arrived without explanation. They would not think about the meal below stairs, just as they did not think about the work that made their own possible. The house did not require them to. Downstairs, the servants moved on. There were fires to tend, rooms to prepare, bells to anticipate. The meal faded quickly into routine, leaving behind only the quiet understanding that tomorrow, arriving earlier, might mean sitting closer to the center. That, in its own restrained way, was motivation enough. The servants' breakfast did not nourish ambition. It nourished order, and order in this house was always hungry for repetition. Work without traces. The true measure of a servant's success was not what they completed, it was what remained invisible. In a Victorian household, the ideal outcome of labor was absence. Absence of noise, absence of disruption, absence of any sign that work had taken place at all. When the family awoke, the house was expected to be ready, not recently prepared, not actively maintained, but simply comfortably ready, as though readiness were its natural state. This required a peculiar kind of discipline. Not just effort, but restraint. Not just speed, but erasure. Before the household above stirred, fires were lit carefully. Coal was arranged so that warmth appeared steady rather than freshly ignited. Ashes were managed discreetly. The goal was not to create heat, but to create the impression that heat had always been there. A fire that looked too new was a failure. A fire that looked inevitable was success. Rooms were cleaned with the same philosophy. Dust was removed, not relocated. Objects were returned to places that suggested they had never moved. Chairs were aligned to imply order rather than correction. Beds were made to look untouched by labor, as though sleep itself had arranged the sheets thoughtfully before leaving. Water was prepared early, basins filled, jugs placed. The effort involved carrying, heating, waiting, was never meant to echo upstairs. Warm water was not a luxury to be admired. It was a condition to be assumed. The servants understood this distinction instinctively. Good work did not announce itself. It dissolved. There is something quietly unsettling about how much intelligence this required. To clean without leaving traces meant knowing exactly how a space was meant to look when it appeared effortless. Too much polish drew attention. Too little suggested neglect. The ideal lay somewhere in between, where the room appeared calm and unquestioning. Every object had a correct position, and servants learned these positions not from instruction manuals, but from repetition and observation. A book returned slightly out of alignment would be noticed. A curtain drawn a few inches too far would be corrected. The house communicated its preferences subtly but firmly. The workday unfolded as a sequence of small disappearances, footprints erased, fingerprints removed, evidence of movement undone. Even the smell of labor, coal, soap, damp cloth, was managed carefully. The house above was not meant to smell like work. It was meant to smell like itself. Servants learned to move in ways that minimized disturbance. Doors were opened and closed without sound. Floors were crossed lightly. Tools were handled quietly, efficiently, and returned immediately. Lingering suggested idleness. Noise suggested incompetence. When the work was done well, it vanished into normality. This invisibility was not framed as dehumanizing. It was framed as professionalism. A skilled servant was one whose presence could not be detected unless required. Being noticed for doing your job was, paradoxically, a sign that something had gone wrong. There is a dry irony in how much effort went into creating the illusion of effortlessness. Entire mornings were spent ensuring that nothing looked as though it had required a morning at all. Upstairs, the family moved through rooms that appeared cooperative. Floors were clean without looking scrubbed. Fires were warm without appearing tended. Clothing lay ready without showing signs of preparation. The house behaved as though it shared their schedule, waking when they did, without complaint. This illusion was the product of precise timing. Work had to be completed early enough to settle. Freshly cleaned surfaces were allowed time to lose their sharpness. Air needed to rest. The house had to forget the servants before the family could enter. Downstairs, the servants rarely reflected on this contradiction. Reflection required time, and time was accounted for. Tasks followed one another seamlessly. One disappearance led to the next. Even mistakes were managed invisibly. A spill was addressed immediately. A misplacement corrected quietly. The system allowed little margin for error, but it also offered no audience for apology. Errors existed only until they were undone. There was no applause for this work, no acknowledgement. A well-run house did not congratulate its servants. It simply continued. Continuation was reward enough. The most unsettling aspect of this arrangement is how natural it came to feel. Servants internalized the logic quickly. Their pride, such as it was, came from how smoothly the house functioned, not from recognition. A day without comment was a successful day. Invisibility became a skill, then a habit, then a condition of belonging. The family did not ask who had prepared the rooms, lit the fires, or warmed the water. Asking would have disrupted the illusion. Comfort depended on not knowing. Knowing required acknowledgement. Acknowledgement required memory. Memory complicated things. The house, therefore, was designed to forget. This forgetting was systematic. Servants' movements were routed through hidden corridors. Their work took place before others were awake or after they had retired. When interaction was unavoidable, it was brief, controlled, and transactional. The goal was not connection. It was continuity. Even exhaustion was meant to remain unseen. Fatigue was managed privately. Slowness was corrected. The system preferred consistency over sympathy. And yet there was a strange stability in this. The house functioned because everyone understood the rules. The rules did not change without warning. The expectations were clear. In a world full of uncertainty, predictability had value. Still, the cost of this predictability was erasure. To work well was to vanish. To vanish completely was to succeed. As the hour passed and the household fully awakened, the servants retreated once more to the margins. Their work lingered in the form of warmth, order, and readiness, but not in memory. The house moved forward as though nothing had happened. And perhaps that was the final irony. The more perfectly the servants performed their duties, the less evidence there was that they had ever been there at all. Work completed, traces removed, presence forgotten. In this house, that was not failure. That was mastery. Private spaces. The most private rooms in the house were not guarded by locks. They were protected by silence. Servants entered these spaces briefly, quietly, and with remarkable precision. Bedrooms, dressing rooms, studies, places where the family existed without performance, places where hair was unarranged, letters unfinished, tempers briefly unpolished. The servants saw all of this, and yet in a way that mattered. They did not see it at all. Their presence in these rooms was temporary by design, long enough to clean, long enough to prepare, never long enough to belong. Private spaces upstairs were built to hold intimacy, but not witnesses. Servants moved through them as if borrowing air. Their work had to be completed before the room noticed them. A bed was made without reading the shape it had held. A desk was dusted without acknowledging what lay written upon it. Clothing was folded without comment, even when it suggested something personal, or inconvenient, or quietly revealing. Nothing here was discussed later, not because servants were constantly warned, but because silence was the cost of continued employment. Words lingered, silence dissolved. This rule was never written down. It did not need to be. The house enforced it through repetition and consequence. A servant who spoke too freely did not last. A servant who noticed but did not comment became invisible, in the right way. Privacy upstairs depended on this understanding. The family lived under the comfortable illusion that their inner lives were protected, even as they were maintained by others. This illusion was essential. It allowed intimacy to exist alongside constant service without friction. Servants learned how to look without appearing to look. Eyes stayed low, hands stayed busy. Attention focused narrowly on the task at hand. Curiosity was not punished explicitly. It simply became dangerous. The unsettling part is how natural this restraint became. Over time, servants stopped framing what they saw as information. It became background. Details blurred. Personal moments passed through them without attaching. A discarded letter was just paper. An unmade bed was just a surface. A half-empty bottle was just an object to be moved. Meaning belonged to the family. The servant's role was to preserve the setting, not interpret the scene. Timing was crucial. Servants entered private rooms when they were empty or nearly so. Early mornings, late afternoons, moments when the house itself seemed to inhale and exhale between occupations. These gaps were carefully scheduled. Privacy, like everything else, ran on a timetable. When interaction was unavoidable, it was brief and stripped of commentary. A maid might help dress a lady without acknowledging the intimacy of the act. A valet might assist with personal items without acknowledging their significance. The work proceeded with professional distance, even when physical proximity suggested otherwise. There is a quiet irony in how much trust this system required. The family entrusted their most personal spaces to people they were not meant to fully acknowledge. The servants were close enough to know everything, and yet required to know nothing. This trust was reinforced by habit rather than affection. Servants who survived long enough proved themselves reliable through silence. Silence became reputation. Private rooms revealed patterns, habits, preferences, repetitions that told a story if one bothered to assemble it. But servants learned not to assemble. Knowing too much made invisibility harder. Even emotional moments passed unrecorded. A sign of distress, a moment of irritation, a quiet indulgence. All were treated as environmental conditions rather than events. You adjusted around them and moved on. The house did not encourage memory. Memory complicated things. Remembering created narratives. Narratives invited judgment. Judgment had no place here. Downstairs, servants might share fragments of their own lives, cautiously, if at all. Upstairs, lives were never discussed. The boundary was absolute. You could touch the objects of intimacy without touching the intimacy itself. There is something deeply unsettling about how effective this system was. It allowed the family to feel private while being constantly assisted. It allowed servants to function without emotional entanglement. Everyone remained intact by remaining distant. This distance was not cold. It was practiced. It was refined. It was as carefully maintained as the rooms themselves. Occasionally something slipped through. A glance held too long. A detail noticed too clearly. These moments were absorbed quickly, smoothed over by routine. The system did not punish curiosity harshly. It simply did not reward it. The reward was continuation. As the day progressed, servants withdrew once more from these private spaces. Beds were made, clothes arranged. Evidence of life was organized into acceptable shapes. The room returned to readiness, stripped of anything that suggested vulnerability. When the family returned, the space greeted them calmly. Nothing looked disturbed, nothing felt observed. The room pretended it had been alone. This illusion required constant maintenance. Servants understood that their role was not just to clean, but to forget. Forgetting was labor. Forgetting took discipline. And so the most intimate rooms in the house remained intimate not because no one entered them, but because everyone who did knew how to leave without taking anything with them. Privacy survived through cooperation. Silence held it in place. In this house, being trusted meant being forgettable in exactly the right way. The morning rhythm. Morning in this house was not a moment. It was a sequence. It unfolded piece by piece, not according to light or appetite, but according to use. One task released the next. One absence created space for another arrival. The servants did not experience the morning as a beginning. They experienced it as motion. Beds were stripped, aired, and remade in quick succession. Sheets were folded with a speed that came from muscle memory rather than urgency. Pillows were reshaped to suggest rest rather than interruption. Nothing about the finished bed was meant to imply that anyone had been awake early to make it so. Water followed its own rhythm. Basins were emptied and refilled. Jugs were replaced before they were missed. The sound of water moving through the house was carefully timed, occurring when doors were closed and hallways empty. Even necessity learned to wait for discretion. Cleaning did not happen all at once. It moved in waves. A room was entered, adjusted, and abandoned before it could be occupied. Servants learned to read the family's habits the way farmers read weather. Certain rooms would soon be needed. Others could wait. Anticipation replaced instruction. The rhythm of the morning depended on knowing where not to be. Servants navigated the house like currents rather than bodies. They flowed around occupied spaces, slipped through unused ones, and withdrew before being acknowledged. The ideal movement was one that left no trace of passage. You were there only long enough to ensure that when someone else arrived, it appeared you had never existed. This required constant attention. A door half closed meant delay. Voices beyond a threshold meant retreat. A familiar cough or footstep altered the route instantly. Servants adjusted without stopping, without comment. The house rewarded those who adapted quickly. Tasks overlapped. While one room was being prepared, another was already being avoided. Work was not linear, it was responsive. The morning demanded flexibility disguised as routine. There is a faint irony in how much mental effort this quiet efficiency required. The servants memorized patterns that were never written down, breakfast habits, preferred routes, the subtle difference between a room being used and a room being about to be used. These distinctions mattered. To misjudge timing was not catastrophic, but it was noticeable. A servant who appeared at the wrong moment disrupted the illusion of autonomy upstairs. The family was meant to feel alone, even while being constantly assisted, and so servants learned to arrive exactly when needed and leave just before being acknowledged. Presence was a narrow window. Miss it, and you were either intrusive or absent. The rhythm of the morning intensified as the household fully awakened. More rooms came into use, more adjustments were required. The pace quickened, but never visibly. Speed had to look like calm. There was no single point at which the morning felt complete. It simply moved forward until the house reached a state of steady operation. Fires burned evenly. Rooms held their shape. Objects were where they belonged. The system stabilized. Downstairs, the servants rarely thought of this as success. Success was silence. No corrections. No summons. No raised voices. A smooth morning meant the rhythm had held. The work itself was repetitive, but the sequence never truly repeated. Small variations required constant recalibration. A guest altered movement patterns. A delayed meal shifted priorities. Servants absorbed these changes without discussion. Even rest followed the rhythm. Brief pauses occurred only when the system allowed them. Standing still too long suggested confusion. Moving without purpose suggested error. Everything had its tempo. There is something quietly unsettling about how completely this rhythm replaced personal time. The servants' mornings were shaped entirely by other people's needs. Their own preferences were irrelevant. Hunger waited, fatigue adapted. And yet, within this constraint, there was a strange competence. Servants took pride not openly but privately in how well they moved through the system. Knowing the rhythm meant survival. Mastering it meant stability. The house itself seemed to listen. It responded to correct timing with ease. Doors opened smoothly, rooms cooperated. When something went wrong, it felt less like failure and more like dissonance. By the time the family settled into their day, the most complex work had already passed. The morning rhythm slowed. Tasks became maintenance rather than preparation. The house breathed more evenly. Above, the family experienced this as a calm start to the day. Everything was ready. Nothing felt rushed. Morning appeared polite and accommodating. Below, the servants adjusted once more, stepping back from the center of activity. Their movements became quieter, less frequent. The rhythm had done its work. The unsettling truth is that this rhythm did not belong to the servants. It used them. It shaped their hours, their movements, their attention, and yet, without them, it would collapse. The morning in this house was a performance without an audience, a carefully rehearsed sequence that existed solely to make someone else's day feel unburdened. Work followed work. Movement followed silence. Presence followed disappearance. And by the time anyone thought to notice, the rhythm had already passed, leaving behind a house that felt naturally, effortlessly awake. The kitchen and the art of preparation. The kitchen did not wait for guests to arrive. It began preparing for them long before anyone decided to be impressive. On days when visitors were expected, the house shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. Upstairs, rooms would later fill with conversation, warmth, and the comfortable noise of social success. Downstairs, the kitchen had already begun tightening its focus. This was where the day quietly decided whether it would be remembered fondly or politely endured. The kitchen was not the heart of the house in the sentimental sense. It was not cozy. It did not invite lingering. It was the operational center where timing mattered more than taste and coordination mattered more than inspiration. If the house was a machine, the kitchen was where its tolerances were tested. Preparation began early. Ingredients were inspected, counted, and arranged. Nothing was assumed. Supplies were checked against lists written days in advance. The kitchen did not trust optimism. It trusted planning. Each dish required more than skill. It required synchronization. Cooking was not a solitary act here. It was a sequence of dependencies. One task released another. One delay affected everything. The kitchen operated on a rhythm that allowed no improvisation, only adjustment. The cook stood at the center of this controlled activity, not as a performer, but as a conductor. Authority here was quiet and absolute. Instructions were given clearly, without ornament. There was no room for debate. The kitchen did not reward creativity, it rewarded precision. Junior staff moved constantly, peeling, chopping, carrying, cleaning. Their work filled the spaces between decisions. They learned quickly that speed alone was not enough. Timing mattered. Delivering something too early created clutter. Delivering it too late created tension. The kitchen tolerated neither. Heat dominated the space. Fires burned steadily. Ovens demanded attention. The temperature rose as the day progressed, thickening the air. Comfort was not part of the design. Endurance was. Smells layered gradually. Raw ingredients gave way to something more complex. This transformation happened almost entirely out of sight of the guests it was meant to please. Upstairs, food would appear complete, balanced, inevitable. Downstairs, it was constantly in flux. There is a quiet irony in how invisible this effort remained. The success of a dinner was judged by taste, presentation, and timing, not by the hours of labor that preceded it. A flawless meal suggested effortlessness. Any sign of struggle would have undermined the illusion. Mistakes were absorbed silently. A sauce adjusted, a dish replaced, a miscalculation corrected before it reached the table. The kitchen allowed no evidence of uncertainty to travel upward. Coordination extended beyond cooking itself. Serving schedules had to align with conversation upstairs. Courses followed cues that could not be heard from below. The kitchen learned to anticipate pauses in speech, changes in mood, the moment when attention shifted from guests to appetite. This required listening without hearing. Signals traveled indirectly. A footman's return, a door closing, a delay between courses. These details mattered. The kitchen read them carefully. There is something unsettling about how much power rested here without recognition. The kitchen determined the pace of the evening, the comfort of the guests, and the reputation of the household. And yet it remained physically and socially removed from the celebration it enabled. The labor was continuous. While one dish was being served, another was already underway. Nothing paused. The kitchen did not experience the meal as an event. It experienced it as a moving deadline. Conversation was limited. Words were tools, not social gestures. Communication focused on function. The noise of the kitchen knives, pots, fire filled the gaps. Silence was unnecessary. As the evening approached, tension increased subtly. Timing became tighter. Errors carried more consequence. The margin for correction narrowed. Still, outward calm was maintained. The kitchen did not panic. Panic wasted energy. Upstairs, guests gathered. Laughter drifted downward, faintly distorted by distance and architecture. The kitchen did not respond. It continued its work. Celebration was not contagious. When dishes left the kitchen, they did so without ceremony. They crossed into another world where their origin no longer mattered. Once upstairs, the food belonged to the family. The effort behind it dissolved. Servants involved in service transitioned seamlessly between these worlds. They carried plates without carrying the weight of preparation. Their expressions remained neutral. Pride, if it existed, stayed internal. The meal unfolded above as planned. Courses arrived smoothly. Timing felt natural. The guests felt attended to, not managed. The house performed generosity. Below, the kitchen adapted constantly. Returned plates were cleared, adjustments made, final dishes prepared. The work did not end when the guests began eating, it intensified. Only when the last course was served did the kitchen's pace shift. Fires were reduced, surfaces cleaned, tools returned to their places. The space began to unwind. There was no celebration downstairs, no acknowledgement that something significant had been achieved. Success was measured by the absence of complaint, not by praise. The unsettling calm of the kitchen lay in its purpose. It existed to serve a moment it would never witness fully. Its work mattered most when it disappeared completely into satisfaction upstairs. By the time the guests departed, the kitchen had already moved on. Evidence of the event was erased. The space returned to readiness, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The house would be remembered for its hospitality. The kitchen would not. And that, quietly, was the point. The banquet and invisibility. The banquet was never loud where it mattered most. Upstairs, laughter traveled easily, glasses touched, chairs shifted. But beneath that polished noise existed a quieter performance, one that did not ask for applause because applause would have been evidence of failure. As the guests settled into their places, the servants adjusted themselves into motion, not hurried, not hesitant, simply present in the narrow spaces between attention and indifference. Their task during the meal was not to serve food. It was to maintain flow. Movement followed rules that were never written down. A step too heavy drew notice. A pause too long invited curiosity. A glance held for more than a moment suggested personality. None of these were desirable. The ideal servant during a banquet was not impressive. They were forgettable. Plates appeared when conversation reached a natural pause. Glasses refilled just before thirst became conscious. Chairs were adjusted without comment. Napkins replaced quietly. Every action happened slightly ahead of need, never after it. The guests felt attended to without ever feeling managed. This precision was not instinctive. It was learned. Servants memorized the geometry of the room, the distances between chairs, the angle of approach, the correct hand for each task. They learned which guests required more attention and which preferred to be ignored. These preferences were noted silently and respected consistently. Hierarchy mattered here as much as anywhere else. Senior servants handled the most visible tasks. Junior staff moved along the edges, clearing, replacing, retreating. Each person had a defined zone. Crossing into another space disrupted the rhythm. Timing governed everything. Courses followed one another according to a schedule that adjusted in real time. If conversation lingered, service slowed. If attention drifted, plates arrived. The servants listened not to words, but to cadence. They read the room the way musicians read a conductor. There is something quietly unsettling about how much awareness this required. Servants were constantly alert, scanning faces, postures, tones. They absorbed the mood of the room without participating in it. Their attention was total, but their presence minimal. Guests noticed the absence of disruption more than the presence of service. The evening felt smooth, natural, as though it had unfolded on its own. That illusion was the product of dozens of small corrections happening just out of focus. Spills were managed instantly. A glass tipped too far was steadied before disaster. A stain was addressed before it became visible. Errors were swallowed whole, leaving no trace. The banquet did not acknowledge effort. It rewarded discretion. There is a faint irony in how invisible labor became more demanding as the event grew more elaborate. A simple meal required less choreography. A grand dinner required precision, bordering on obsession. The more impressive the banquet, the less visible the work behind it could afford to be. Conversation upstairs often revolved around ease, how comfortable the room felt, how well everything was arranged. Compliments floated freely, but they rarely landed anywhere specific. Praise addressed the house, not the people. Downstairs, the servants absorbed this without reaction. Praise was not currency here. Continuation was. Throughout the evening, the servants' own needs were postponed. Hunger waited. Fatigue adapted. Rest was theoretical. The banquet existed on borrowed energy, taken quietly, and returned later, if at all. Movement through the room followed patterns that avoided interruption. Servants approached from the correct side, retreated at the correct angle, and vanished into doorways designed for exactly that purpose. Architecture assisted invisibility. Curtains, panels, and hidden passages swallowed people efficiently. The guests did not notice this disappearance. They were not meant to. Noticing would have broken the spell. The banquet depended on the belief that comfort was effortless. As the evening progressed, the rhythm shifted subtly. Courses grew lighter. Conversation softened. Attention drifted. Servants adjusted again, scaling back without stopping. The room moved toward conclusion without announcing it. At no point did the servants relax fully. Relaxation implied presence. Presence invited memory. Memory complicated the narrative. The final course arrived as gently as the first. Plates were cleared, glasses settled, chairs scraped softly. The guests remained wrapped in the illusion that everything had unfolded naturally, without orchestration. When the guests eventually rose and moved elsewhere, the servants remained briefly, resetting the room. Evidence of the banquet was erased quickly. Tablecloths removed, surfaces wiped. The space returned to neutrality. It was as though the event had never happened. Only then did the servants step back fully, retreating into corridors and rooms designed to absorb them. Their work lingered only in satisfaction upstairs, not in recollection. The banquet would be remembered as elegant. The house would be remembered as gracious. The servants would not be remembered at all. And that absence was not an accident. It was the goal. Invisibility during a banquet was not neglect. It was mastery. Rare hours away from work. Rest for the servants did not arrive boldly. It did not announce itself with leisure or promise transformation. When it appeared at all, it came quietly, briefly, and with conditions. These rare hours away from work were not days off in the modern sense. They were pauses, narrow openings in an otherwise continuous sequence of duties. A few hours here, an afternoon there. Time enough to step beyond the gate, but not far enough to forget where it led back. When the house allowed it, servants left in ones and twos, never in groups large enough to draw attention. Their absence was carefully scheduled so that the machinery of the household never stalled. Even rest had to be coordinated. Outside the house, the world felt different. Not freer exactly, but less structured. Streets did not assign rank so visibly. Footsteps were not interpreted. Silence did not carry instruction. For a short while, movement belonged to the person moving. These moments were modest. A walk along a familiar road, a stop at a small shop, the purchase of something unnecessary, but comforting, a flower, a ribbon, a piece of bread slightly sweeter than usual. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of maintenance. Servants did not imagine these outings would change their lives. Expectation would have been excessive. The value lay in the interruption itself. For a short time, the rhythm of the house loosened its grip. Clothing changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough to mark difference. Work uniforms stayed behind. Simpler garments took their place, still respectable, still cautious, but chosen, at least in part, by the wearer. There is a faint irony in how carefully these freedoms were exercised. Even outside the house, servants remained attentive. Time was watched, money counted, boundaries respected. Freedom here was not expansive. It was precise. Some walked without destination, simply enjoying movement without purpose. Others had routine shops, visited regularly, paths worn familiar. These habits offered comfort. Predictability extended beyond work. Conversation happened more freely, though still guarded. Words felt less monitored. Laughter appeared cautiously, as if unsure whether it was permitted. Stories were exchanged that had nothing to do with the household. That absence mattered. And yet, even in these moments, the house remained present. It lingered as an awareness rather than a thought. Time away was measured against time returning. The gate was both exit and reminder. There is something quietly unsettling about how small these pleasures were. A cup of tea in a public place, the smell of flowers, the simple act of standing still without instruction. These were enough to feel restorative. Servants learned to stretch these moments without overreaching. Enjoyment was kept proportional. To want too much was to invite disappointment. Contentment survived best when expectations remained low. As the hours passed, the pull back toward duty grew stronger, not through force, but through habit. The body recognized the approaching return before the mind did. Time folded inward again. Returning to the house required adjustment. Voices lowered, postures changed. The rhythm resumed. Personal moments were packed away neatly, like items not meant to be left out. Downstairs, other servants noticed the change subtly, a different expression, a quieter calm. These signs were temporary. Work absorbed them quickly. The irony, of course, is that these rare hours away made continued labor possible. Without them, exhaustion would have sharpened into something unmanageable. The system allowed just enough relief to sustain itself. These pauses did not disrupt hierarchy, they did not alter position, they did not offer escape, but they reminded the servants that life existed beyond tasks, even if only briefly. Memory played a quiet role here. A flower pressed into a book, a taste remembered, a conversation recalled during long hours of routine. These fragments softened repetition. The house did not acknowledge this necessity. It did not need to. It benefited regardless. Rest, even minimal, improved efficiency. Contentment reduced friction. Servants understood this without resentment. The arrangement was clear. The pauses were not gifts. They were allowances. As night approached, the day's work closed around these moments again. The servants returned to their places. The house reclaimed its order. The rare hours away faded into memory, leaving behind a subtle resilience. Not hope, not ambition, just endurance made slightly more bearable. These small freedoms did not change the shape of a life, but they changed how that life felt while continuing. And in a system built on continuation, that was enough. Adaptation and advancement. Change in the servant's world rarely arrived as transformation. It arrived as adjustment. Over time, the rhythm of the house stopped feeling external. What had once required attention settled into the body. Movements became instinctive. Schedules no longer needed checking. The house no longer felt like something to learn. It felt like something to inhabit. This was adaptation, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that survives repetition. Most servants did not measure progress in ambition. Ambition required imagining a different life, and imagination was expensive. Progress was measured instead in familiarity, in knowing which doors opened without resistance, in understanding which tasks carried more weight, in recognizing which responsibilities signaled trust rather than burden. Skills accumulated slowly. A kitchen maid learned timing. A footman learned discretion. A housemaid learned which rooms required extra attention and which required restraint. These lessons were not taught formally. They were absorbed through observation, correction, and time. Advancement, when it came, was subtle. A change in duty, a shift in schedule, access to slightly different spaces, perhaps a key, perhaps a ledger, perhaps responsibility for someone else's mistakes as well as your own. These were not promotions announced aloud. They revealed themselves gradually, often noticed only in hindsight. One day, you realized you were being consulted. Another day, you noticed someone waiting for your instruction. There is a quiet irony in how advancement often meant more work rather than less. Increased responsibility brought increased expectation. Visibility increased slightly, but only within the system, never beyond it. You became known but not recognized. Not everyone moved forward. Many remained where they began, performing the same tasks year after year. This was not always failure. For some, stability itself was success. Predictability offered safety. A known role reduced risk. The system rewarded reliability more than brilliance. Consistency mattered. A servant who caused no disruptions, made no errors, and attracted no attention could remain employed for decades. In a world where employment itself was uncertain, that mattered. Those who advanced learned quickly that progress had limits. The ceiling was visible. There were positions one could reach and positions one could never approach. This clarity prevented disappointment. Hope, when tightly managed, did not sting. Adaptation also meant emotional adjustment. Servants learned which feelings to display and which to store privately. Excitement was tempered, frustration managed, contentment cultivated carefully. Emotional steadiness was a professional skill. There is something unsettling about how completely this emotional discipline became internalized. Over time, servants stopped noticing the effort involved. Calm replaced reaction. Detachment replaced expectation. The system did not demand enthusiasm, it demanded reliability. Advancement brought proximity to decision-making, but not ownership of decisions. Senior servants coordinated, but they did not choose the direction of the house. They ensured continuity. They protected rhythm. And yet within these constraints, identity formed. A servant became known for competence, for discretion, for calm, under pressure. Reputation circulated quietly. This mattered more than praise. You could hear it in how others spoke to you. Less explanation, more assumption. Trust expressed through silence rather than compliment. The unsettling calm of this progression lay in its logic. The system did not promise fulfillment. It promised survival. Those who adapted thrived within that promise. Those who resisted rarely lasted. There was no single moment where one felt they had arrived. Advancement did not conclude, it stabilized. You reached a point where the work no longer surprised you, where the house responded predictably, where days blurred together without friction. For many, this was enough. The house itself seemed to prefer this kind of person, someone who fit the rhythm, someone who did not question the structure, but navigated it efficiently. The system rewarded those who understood its limits. Not all adaptation was conscious. Bodies aged into the work. Movements slowed but became more precise. Experience replaced speed. Knowledge compensated for strength. As years passed, servants watched others arrive and depart. New faces learned old routines. The house remained unchanged. This continuity reinforced a particular understanding of progress, not as escape, but as endurance. The idea of moving up was therefore modest. A slightly better position, a little more stability, perhaps a small increase in pay, perhaps the ability to influence schedules quietly. These gains accumulated gently. There is a dry humor in how little the system demanded in return for this security. Loyalty, silence, competence. The price was clear. By the time servants reached the later stages of their working lives, ambition had softened into something else. Not resignation, but acceptance. The house had shaped them, and they had learned how to exist within its shape. Adaptation in the end was not about becoming something new. It was about becoming sustainable. The unsettling truth is that this worked. The system endured because it offered enough stability to keep people invested, even without promise of transformation. Not everyone progressed, not everyone needed to. For most, the goal was never ascent, it was continuity. And in a house built on repetition, continuity was the highest form of success. The house continues to breathe. Years passed without announcing themselves. They moved through the house quietly, the way dust settles when no one is watching. Nothing dramatic marked their arrival. Nothing ceremonial marked their departure. The house did not acknowledge time as an event. It absorbed it. Servants came and went. Some stayed long enough to become part of the structure itself, their movements so familiar that the house seemed to expect them. Others passed through briefly, leaving no trace beyond a memory that faded quickly. The house did not grieve these changes. It adjusted. Work repeated itself with remarkable patience. Fires were lit. Rooms were prepared. Meals were served and cleared. The sequence held. If anything changed, it did so gradually, without resistance. New tools appeared. Old habits softened. But the rhythm endured. This was not nostalgia. It was maintenance. The house learned new hands the way it learned new furniture. It made space. It adapted. It did not pause to reflect. Reflection was unnecessary. Continuation was the priority. Above stairs, generations shifted. Faces aged. Voices changed. Preferences evolved slightly. Downstairs, the system absorbed these differences and translated them into routine. A new family member meant a new schedule. A new habit meant a new adjustment. Nothing disrupted the underlying logic. The house did not remember individuals. It remembered patterns. There is something quietly unsettling about how little acknowledgement this required. Lives passed through the house and left behind almost nothing. Work completed itself and vanished. The system did not accumulate memory. It reset daily. Evenings arrived with the same practiced calm. Lights softened. Rooms settled into order. The noise of the day thinned out. Servants moved more slowly now, but not carelessly. Fatigue was managed. Precision remained. As night deepened, the house entered its most honest state. Without guests, without performance, it revealed its true preference: readiness. Everything was returned to position. Everything was prepared for a day that had not yet arrived. This preparation was not hopeful. It did not imagine improvement. It simply ensured continuity. There is a faint irony in how much effort went into creating the impression of rest. The house did not sleep. It paused. Even in stillness, it remained attentive. Fires were banked, doors secured, final checks completed. Nothing was left unresolved. Downstairs, servants withdrew gradually, their presence thinning as tasks concluded. Silence expanded, but it was not empty. It was structured. The house held itself together in the absence of motion. Somewhere, someone would always be awake. Not for reflection, for readiness. Time in this house was cyclical rather than linear. Days did not lead anywhere. They returned. The end of one day was simply the beginning of preparation for the next. This repetition created stability, not stagnation. The unsettling part is how comfortable this became. Servants learned to exist within this cycle without expecting resolution. Careers did not arc dramatically. Lives did not crescendo. They continued. And continuation in this context was success. The house did not require gratitude. It did not offer recognition. It functioned. That was enough. When servants left for marriage, illness, age, or opportunity, the house accepted replacements without ceremony. New hands learned old paths. New eyes learned to look without seeing too much. The system endured. No plaque recorded this labor. No ledger preserved these lives. The house did not archive effort. It consumed it. And yet there was a strange dignity in this anonymity. The work mattered even if it was forgotten. The system relied on it regardless of acknowledgement. The house breathed because people allowed it to. Night settled fully now. The last lamps dimmed. The corridors emptied. The air cooled. Everything rested exactly where it should. This was not an ending. It was a state. Tomorrow would arrive without surprise. Bells would ring. Fires would be lit. Rooms would be prepared. The sequence would resume as it always had. The house did not anticipate tomorrow. It assumed it. Under the quiet surface of evening, the system remained intact. No explanation was needed. No memory required. The work had already taught the house how to continue. The unsettling calm of this realization lingers, that systems can outlast the people who serve them, that repetition can replace meaning, that readiness can become a way of life. And yet there is also a quiet comfort here. The house does not demand belief. It does not ask to be admired. It simply continues. As the night deepens, everything returns to readiness. Not hopeful, not anxious, just prepared. The house breathes. The system holds. Tomorrow waits patiently. And nothing else is required.